Hello everyone, welcome to Mr. Noctory today. We're heading to ancient Egypt, around the year 1550, before the Common Era. Egypt wasn't just about mummies and pyramids. It also featured contraceptive methods that would make modern psychologists drop their AirPod sex. Childbirth and moderation were considered sacred responsibilities, but Egyptian women still found ways to take a break from getting pregnant. Contraception wasn't just a physiological issue. You'll witness noble wives, physicians, and crocodiles all appearing together in a true survival comedy. They took crocodile dung, mixed it with honey or natron, an alkaline salt, and inserted it into the vagina to stop sperm from reaching the uterus. You heard that right. They applied crocodile dung as a kind of cervical cap. Funny, huh? Before we begin, if this feels like a peaceful place to hide out at night, hit like and subscribe, but only if you really want to. No pressure. Like the old tavern rules, only if you need a quiet corner. And you know what I love the most? Reading the comments to see where you're from and what time it is for you. Whether it's New York or Norway, 1 a.m. or 5 a.m., you're still here, and I see you. Now turn off the lights. Maybe switch on a small fan, not because it's hot, but for that soft buzzing hum. Welcome to ancient Egypt, where gods lived with doctors, where Nile swamps were a giant pharmacy, and where sex was politics. Don't be surprised, because here to give birth or not to give birth decided bloodlines, status, and sometimes survival. And when you don't have condoms, no pills, when you live in a world where even the god of fertility takes days off, you find a way at all costs, even if that cost is a lump of dung. We're talking about an era of priestesses rubbing incense on their lower bellies, pharaohs with over 100 kids who couldn't remember anyone's name, and fifth wives quietly counting menstrual cycles like they were tracking monsoon winds. Step outside, cross the relief-covered corridors of Thebes. You hear the sound of garlic being pounded, fish drying, and sistrum bells echoing from the temple of Isis. Behind the market, there's an old woman selling what looks like a rural version of a pharmacy, a jar of thick brown paste labeled with palm leaves, premium Sobek dung, fresh this morning. In ancient Egypt, women held respectable positions. They could inherit, get educated, even sue their husbands. But one thing they still had to handle on their own: contraception. No one taught them in school. No public health flyers. No pre-sex counseling organized by the state. Just rumors and strange recipes written on papyrus scrolls as long as royal welcome mats and the wisdom of mothers. Not all of it was rumor. Some were documented, disturbingly detailed, in the Kahun Papyrus, the oldest surviving medical text from ancient Egypt. Inside you'll find contraceptive formulas that sound more like poison-making guides, honey animal dung crushed date pits, or tree resin dissolved and inserted vaginally, gently but with experimental flair. The recipes were written in red ink, the ink of life, and sometimes of risk. No solid proof that these concoctions work perfectly, but no one could prove they didn't either. Some believe that, despite the weirdness, ingredients like honey and dung with high pH might have created an environment hostile to sperm. Of course, modern scientists might raise an eyebrow, but you know what? When there are no pharmaceutical factories, people trust their gut. And when gut feeling gets written down, you know it's serious. Picture this: a woman named Satya, 25 years old, 3 kids, 1 husband. That husband just returned from worshipping Sobek, crocodile god, carrying a mug of beer and eyes full of fire. Satya knew if she let things happen tonight, next month she'd be pregnant again. And this time her mother-in-law would say, "So, number 4, huh? No worries, our house is big." The kind of sentence that makes any mother want to crawl into a canopic jar and sleep until Dynasty 34. So Satya did what many Egyptian women had done before her. She grabbed a bit of crocodile dung, still warm, pliable, and full of faith, and applied it like hope for tomorrow. Her husband, Paka, with oiled hair and religious belief in cold beer, walked in. He glanced at the small jar by the bed and asked, "That lotion looks interesting." Satya smiled faintly and replied, "Yeah, lotion for the future." Paka nodded. He had no idea his wife just turned a risky night into one that was probably a lot safer. Because in a world where women had to protect themselves at all costs, humor and a bit of cunning were their silent weapons. She applied crocodile dung, still warm, pliable, and full of faith, as if smearing hope onto tomorrow. Sounds awful. Yeah, it was. But what if I told you? They truly believed, and maybe they weren't entirely wrong. You'll hear it all, every detail, every story, every breakdown, from myth to chemistry, from late-night whispers between mothers to the skeptical eyes of healers. Because you're not just hearing a strange tale, you're entering a world where reproduction was power, fear, and silent resistance. And in that world, crocodile dung wasn't just waste. It was a choice, a silent refusal to conceive a form of freedom in a sticky shape. And so, the story begins. You just woke up. Your eyes are still stinging. Your hair is stuck to your face. And, well, the bed is as damp as if the Nile paid a midnight visit. Not because you wet the bed, but because in ancient Egypt, humidity was the uninvited third party, always lying between husband and wife. This is around the year 1550, before the Common Era, the beginning of the New Kingdom, a time of transformation caught between wars with the Hyksos and the dream of rebuilding the nation with beds that were still damp. You're not a queen, nor a priestess. You're a middle-class urban woman, rich enough not to starve, but not rich enough to hire someone to fan your butt all night. Your bed is typical, made of hardwood low-no mattress and woven with flax ropes. You lay a mat made of reeds on top. If it's hot, you sleep on the roof. If it's cold, like tonight, you lie between 2 blankets that smell, like a camel just walked by. Your husband is snoring like thunder on the other side. Your cat, named Tefnut, after the goddess of moisture, is licking your feet. And in the corner of the room, the ceramic jar of drinking water now smells like the god Sobek bathed in it. You sit up, your back aching, like you just got dragged to build a pyramid. One hand holds a scoop of water, the other scratches. Not because it itches, but because your blanket is a favorite hangout for fleas. Sometimes you even see fleas crawling around the edge of the mat, gathering like they're hosting a bloodsucker summit. The Nile mosquitoes buzz by your ears, composing a gentle symphony in the key of hell. And you don't have a net. No one in your class does. The only things you use to repel mosquitoes are burning incense, or, if you've got extra time, rubbing scented resin around your neck and ankles, partly for insects, partly for hoping someone thinks you're fancy. Last night, you dreamed of a world with memory foam mattresses, with air conditioning, with moisture-resistant cream, with a spa. But then you woke up in ancient Egypt, where the only spa was smearing clay and praying that the goddess Hathor wouldn't make your eyebrows fall off. You sigh. A new day begins, and you know the dampness on your back isn't necessarily water. It might be sweat, it might be dew, it might be water mixed with dreams, and the memory of one more night survived. You turn to your husband, still lying sideways, mouth open, his arm across your face, like his survival depends on blocking your vision. "Babe, our bed is sinking," he mumbles. "No, you peed on the mat." You reply softly, like a haiku forgotten in the middle of a desert. Silence returns to the house, only the wind whistling through the cracks and the sound of Tefnut chewing on something you're too scared to check. Welcome to Egypt, where every morning begins with the question, did I actually survive the night? And if you did, you owe thanks to many forces Bez, the tiny god who scares off nightmares Taweret, the hippo goddess who protects women's sleep, and that cat, even if all it does is lick your feet. You quietly think, if one day you were born into nobility, the first thing you'd wish for isn't gold or jewelry. It's a dry bed, just dry. That alone would be enough to thank the entire pantheon of gods. You start your day with one important mission, not having another baby, not because you don't love children, but because you're still recovering from the last birth, where the midwife screamed louder than you did, and the umbilical cord felt like the baby brought your entire family destiny in yarn form. In ancient Egypt, contraception was a matter of survival. There was no national family planning, no little pink pills. You had a lump of crocodile poop. That's right, a soft brownish thing that could be mixed with honey or clay, rolled up like a sacred stone and placed into a spot where the sun never shines. Don't laugh. Egyptians didn't do this to torture themselves. They believed that crocodile dung, blessed by Sobek, the crocodile-headed god of fertility, would scare the sperm so much it would turn back. And surprisingly, it might have actually worked. Compared to modern birth control pills, with their pink packs, alarms and side effects like acne headaches and weight gain, putting a fragrant crocodile poop pellet in your body might seem more straightforward and less complicated, though no less unforgettable. Modern researchers believe animal dung, especially when combined with acidic substances like honey or fermented vinegar, could create a high pH environment that makes it difficult for sperm to survive. In other words, a delicate, sperm-destroying mixture, with a scent nobody wants to remember. Just imagine the scene. Your husband, trying his best to be understanding, walks in and smells something odd. He frowns. "What's that smell?" You answer flatly, "That's the smell of happiness." Then turn away, leaving a confused man standing there, face to face with the invisible force known as poop-based family planning. In the dim room, flickering with candlelight, the midwife is stirring a mixture thick as porridge mixed with bran. Before placing it in your body, she quietly chants Sobek's name 3 times, rotates in the direction of the Nile's flow, and asks you to keep a papyrus stem under your pillow. Like a mini ritual against bad luck, you grip your hands, close your eyes, and pray to Isis to spare you from birthing a 5th child with the same forehead as his father. In some regions, donkey or cow dung was also used, in case you didn't live near the Nile or lacked access to crocodiles. At the market, you might overhear women whispering to one another, "Hey, was that soft dung you used yesterday from a black donkey or a red cow?" I mix both worked wonders. My husband still doesn't get why it's been 2 years and no new arrivals. Sounds strange, but in a world where giving birth too often could kill you, what's stranger, using poop or dying from childbirth? Of course, not everything went smoothly. Some women had allergic reactions, some felt burning, and none of them had a gynecologist. If you were itchy, you chewed mint leaves. If you had a fever, you burned incense and prayed. And if you cried, you let the tears fall into your papyrus basket, then wrapped and buried it, as a way to send letters to the gods. Some formulas were even scented, with ingredients like myrrh, star anise, or cinnamon bark, creating something called premium contraceptive pellets, reserved for the upper class or those with ties to priestesses. No one said it out loud, but women passed down these recipes as if they were survival spells. There was no user manual, only whispers and hope. Your life, your body, held in the hands of a crocodile. A clump of dung and a little hope that you'd be allowed to rest for a few more years. Before your uterus got called back to duty, have you ever sat there wondering, why did our ancestors choose crocodile dung and not goat dung, cow dung, or anything easier to catch and less likely to bite back? Welcome to ancient Egypt, where belief, inconvenience, and sacred poop combined into one form of contraception. Crocodile dung wasn't just dung. It was a gift from the god Sobek, the crocodile-shaped deity embodiment of power, fertility, and protection. In a world where childbirth could kill you, Egyptians believed that only a god with 2 rows of sharp teeth and unblinking eyes could protect you from your own uterus. You don't joke around with Sobek, just like you don't joke around with pregnancy when you're still healing from your last birth, or a miscarriage you never even told anyone about. Goat poop is easy to find. It falls like little dry beans, light tidy, almost harmless. And that's exactly the problem. You want something strong, something that makes sperm panic, not something even bacteria can't be bothered with. Crocodile dung, thick river scented, mixed with a little fermented vinegar and honey, created a high pH mixture so hostile that anything living would think twice before entering. Put a bit under your pillow and you'll dream of Sobek. Put it in the wrong place and you won't see anything again. An old proverb, once whispered by midwives into the ears of newly married girls. Why not? Chicken poop. They tried that. Somebody, somewhere, tried them all. From lizard droppings to pigeon poop to neutered rooster dung. The result? Some gave birth to twins. Some gave birth early. Some gave birth to babies who could imitate crocodile growls when hungry. Of course, no one verified this, but the stories kept being told for centuries. Picture yourself standing in a bustling market beside the Nile, noise everywhere, goats bleating, pots shattering, and in the middle of it all, a small stall under a shady canopy with a wooden sign, "Fresh crocodile dung, today only." 2 midwives whispering, "This batch is from the south, murkier river, stronger dung." Yeah, that Fayum pond stuff from last year was so weak. My daughter still had twins after using it. But it has to be on the full moon. Use it on the wrong day and Sobek won't answer. And did you know? Many noble women even hired someone just to stalk crocodiles for poop. Because according to legend, If you collect crocodile dung on Sobek's birthday, then recite a chant while facing the river with closed eyes. The contraceptive effect doubles. The dung must still be warm. Right hand holds vinegar. Left hand grips a piece of red cloth. Say the chant exactly. Then, wait for the result. Some midwives even created a simple ritual before handing over the medicine, with fire lotus scent and tiny shell bells. You weren't just inserting a pellet. You were inviting Sobek to personally intervene with your uterus. During the New Kingdom era, crocodile dung became a form of trade among priestesses. There were even sales pitches. Fresh dung from the Fayum marshes, certified by the official Sobek temple. Buy 3 pellets, get a lotus-scented deodorizer free. And noble women? They hired crocodile hunters just to study digestive patterns. Not everyone had a stable supply, so these carefully preserved pellets, sun-dried in sacred rituals, became precious assets, the equivalent of protective talismans. Some said adding lotus oil made the smell more pleasant. Truth is, it was still unpleasant. But in your world, where having a 5th child meant dying young, crocodile scent was a small price to pay. I'd rather place sacred dung inside my body than place my life in the hands of fate. A hastily carved note found in a bedroom wall in Thebes, discovered in 1922, beside a papyrus basket sealed with the image of Sobek. And so, through the centuries, crocodile dung became the silent gatekeeper for countless women, not because it was the best choice, but because in a world with no choices, it was the one they were allowed to hope in. Imagine you're living in ancient Egypt. The flood season has just arrived. The Nile overflows. Fertilizer is carried everywhere. Fields reek of fresh mud. The air is damp, heavy with the scent of reeds and dead fish scattered along the shore. And in the middle of it all, you, an Egyptian woman, are wading knee-deep through water just to find a usable lump of crocodile dung. Not for planting, but for birth control. Your husband is at home patching the roof torn by wind. The children are coughing with a rattling sound. And you, having just suffered a miscarriage during last year's flood, don't want a repeat, but you don't have contraceptive pills. No OB/GYN, and no one willing to hear you say, "I don't want another child." So you go to the river. You follow the trail of drifting crocodile poop. You ask the village midwife when you should insert the mixture today to align with the moon cycle. You don't do this because you're superstitious. You do it because you want to live a few more years. You want your child to have enough milk. You want to keep your own body in a world where everyone treats your womb like public property. And you are not alone. There's a whole line of other women, each holding a small pouch of vinegar, a few sprigs of perfume grass, and a scrap of papyrus with handwritten dosages of each remedy, sitting quietly by the riverbank, waiting for nightfall. No one laughs, no one talks, but their eyes, tired, calm, seem like they've long grown used to carrying both their own lives and the unborn on their shoulders. Some of them were once fallen noble women. Others have never stepped into a temple. But they all share one thing in common. They're trying to survive. While their husbands sip barley beer at home or pray to the gods for a better harvest, they sit by the river, holding a homemade medicine pellet, waiting for the exact moment just as their mothers taught them. You think sex is just about the bedroom. Not in ancient Egypt. Here sex was ritual, symbol, politics, religion, and sometimes weather forecasting. You wake up in a middle-class household in Thebes. On the table is a small clay statue of a couple embracing. It's not decoration, it's a charm. You ask your foster mother, "Why is that next to the onions?" She casually replies, "To prevent a barren daughter-in-law." Sex in the life of Egyptians wasn't just for reproduction. It was a way to show power, luck, and a connection to the divine. Min, the fertility god, was often depicted with eternal erection. His statue was paraded during harvest festivals because they believed that if Min didn't rise, neither would the crops. Even everyday objects carried sexual symbolism. A round mirror represented the sun and the vagina. Ivory combs were carved with the name of goddess Hathor. Pastries shaped like genitals were used in Hathor's festivals to bring good fortune. You look at your bronze mirror to check your grey hairs and suddenly realize you've been holding a fertility prayer in your hand all morning. You step into the public bathhouse. On the wall is a love poem, but it's more than poetry. It's instructions on arousing desire through music and scent. You laugh. In the 21st century, you listen to Lofi playlists to focus. In the 16th century, before the Common Era, they played flutes to set the mood. You think of Tinder, but ancient Egyptians had lover-summoning charms. A small cloth with a lover's name wrapped in onion and buried under a fig tree. If a cat sniffed it within 3 days, the curse worked. On ancient papyri, there were incredibly detailed instructions for sexual therapy. If a couple lacked harmony, fumigate the house with resin mixed with cow dung. If the husband had impotence, stay silent for 3 days and eat dried fish liver. If the wife was exhausted, offer goddess Hathor musical instruments and pastries shaped like phalluses. No Freud, no Jung. Only the belief that if sex went wrong, the gods were displeased. You visit Karnak temple and notice small carvings in a corner. 2 men making love. No blurred faces, no erasures. The ancient Egyptians didn't stigmatize orientation. They only cared whether you followed the ritual properly. Even sexual dreams were recorded and interpreted in dream books. Dream of kissing a red-haired woman, money's coming. Dream of being rejected sexually, change business direction. Dream of having sex with the dead, prepare to be protected by ancestors. You turn into the festival market. There's a stall selling painted wooden masks, shaped like the faces of sex gods, Bes, Hathor, Min. Each mask comes with romantic advice etched on a small piece of sheepskin, something like, "Dance like you've never been hurt, because the gods are watching." Children played a game of tossing phallic pastries into baskets. Whoever scored was a child chosen by Hathor. No one found it strange. No one blushed. Sex wasn't just private business, it was social. Who was allowed to do what, who must abstain during Isis festivals, who got rewarded for birthing a 3rd son in a row, and who was punished for adultery, buried alive with their tongue cut out. Yes, that punishment existed. It was written clearly in the legal text, Papyrus Salt 124. Sex, in the context of the Nile, wasn't just biology. It was the story of the body, the soul power and fear. Fear of punishment, fear of infertility, fear of offending the horny yet sensitive deities. You leave the house. Walk along the riverbank. You hear birds calling across the reeds. You see a couple holding hands praying before the sun. And suddenly, you understand love and sex in Egypt weren't confined to bedrooms. They slipped into prayers, dreams, fears, and into the hope that a new generation would be born. You think using crocodile dung is strange? Wait until you understand why Egyptian women did it. Not to stay healthy, like modern ads say, but to maintain the tiny bit of control they had over their own bodies. You're living around the year 1300, before the Common Era in the Nile Delta. But if you look a little farther, toward Mesopotamia or Athens, you'll notice something strange there. Women were not only bound by children, they were also forbidden to even think about not wanting to give birth. In Mesopotamia, avoiding pregnancy went against the will of the gods. In Athens, women weren't allowed to read, let alone learn contraceptive formulas. But in Egypt, priestesses not only knew how to read, they also guarded those secrets. And in the shadows of temples, sometimes those secrets were passed down like a legacy, not for the nation, but for their own survival. Giving birth wasn't a choice, it was a duty, and not just a duty to your family. It was a duty to society, to the gods, to the state. In this world, your uterus was national property. Temples needed more hands to serve the gods. The wealthy needed slaves. Farmers needed more arms for the plough. And nobles needed heirs without the blood of servant mothers. Birthing was encouraged. Not birthing was silent resistance. And in many cases, it was organized resistance. There were groups of women who secretly gathered at the temple of Hathor, the goddess of love and music. They didn't just sing and dance. They exchanged recipes, tested sponge thickness, mixed tree sap based on the lunar cycle. A kind of women's health clinic, disguised as a religious ritual, because in a world where men controlled all official medicine, Egyptian women created their own medicine. Medicine of silence, of whispers, and of choice. A woman choosing to wear a contraceptive amulet made of resin and root hidden in her hair wasn't afraid of childbirth. She was afraid of losing freedom, because each pregnancy was another chain, to a husband, to a family, to a system she never got to choose. Contraception, in many medical scrolls, was written like a survival guide, not women's health care, but a gentle weapon. A lump of dry dung, a resin from acacia trees, a prayer at full moon. All of it was how Egyptian women claimed the last inch of bodily autonomy. In a world where they couldn't divorce, couldn't say no to sex, couldn't have their names carved on stone, unless they died giving birth. You walk into an ancient library on the shelf, a papyrus scroll handwritten by a priestess. Next to the contraceptive recipe is a strange little poem. Tonight I shall not bloom like the lotus. No honey for the bees, I keep the water, so I don't become a field. A menstrual verse, or a political manifesto hidden in reed paper lines. The Egyptians didn't have International Women's Day. They had goddesses. They had a female pharaoh like Hatshepsut. They had statues of breastfeeding women carved into rock with serene expressions. But in everyday life it was the nameless women who were the true rebels. Not with swords, not with spears, but by refusing to birth another heir to pain. You sit under the blinding sun, watching the silent river pass. Some men are praying to Sobek for abundant crops, and across the bank a woman quietly buries a crocodile dung, contraceptive pill in the sand, as if bearing a secret. She doesn't need anyone to know. She just needs to not be bound by children she didn't want. That isn't selfishness, it's survival. It isn't about opposing men. It's about reclaiming herself, even if only for a moment. And in that moment, the history of resistance is written in herb ink, menstrual blood, and silent tears. Have you ever watched a surgical movie? Bright white lights, sharp scalpels, rubber gloves. Now erase all of that and imagine you're lying naked, lotus leaves covering your stomach, in a 104-degree clay room that smells like dried grass, and a healer who just washed his hands in river scum. Welcome to ancient Egyptian surgery, where science, religion, bravery, and a bit of blissful ignorance all get mixed together. A surgery to remember by the Nile. Let's say you're a young soldier in a war against Nubia. You've got a gash on your thigh, deep flesh torn, bleeding like a monsoon. They carry you to the temple of the goddess Sekhmet, where the healers double as part-time psychics. They lay you on a wooden plank. No anesthesia, no sterilization, just tree resin ash and a blunt copper blade. Someone sticks a piece of dry camel hide in your mouth and says, "Bite down, don't scream, the gods are listening." And just like that, they cut. Your thigh is stitched up with flax strings. The smell of burnt flesh and iron blood swirls like a hymn of survival. When you wake up, the first thing you ask is, "Am I alive?" And the answer is, "Yeah, but your left leg is now a bit shorter than your right." No anesthesia, no stainless steel scalpel, just copper blades, bare hands, and the shallow breath of the patient. And if you're lucky, you get to bite a piece of dry camel hide so you don't scream too loud. Appendicitis? Sorry, doesn't exist here. But you might get diagnosed with snake in the belly disease, and they'll cut you open to check if a snake is hiding in there. No joke. There are texts describing just that. Surgery with dolls and vegetables. Since autopsies weren't allowed, Egyptian medical students had to learn on clay or wooden dummies, sometimes slicing onions to practice. A popular tale tells of a young healer who practiced cuts on cucumbers, sewed with goat hair, and modelled human livers with steamed barley dough. Strangely enough, the skills transferred as long as you didn't slice in the wrong direction. The Egyptians were famously unimpressed with the brain, truly. When embalming, they removed the brain first and tossed it out like trash, because to them, the heart was the seat of emotions and thought. Who you love, what you remember, how smart you are, it all lived in the heart and the brain, just a skull cooler. So if you had a head injury, sorry, they'd smear tree resin on your forehead and pray to Anubis to fix it. Ancient Egypt didn't allow public autopsies. Cutting open the dead was seen as a spiritual offense. But some healers, especially in Sekhmet's temples, secretly performed dissections to study where the organs were and sometimes to test new medicines. One record says they noticed the liver swelled when someone was angry and believed it was where rage gets stored, which meant if you had hepatitis, they'd cure it by telling you to have more fun, liver liberation. Ancient surgery was always a gamble. Some texts describe hemorrhoid surgery with heated sickles, followed by shark ash to suck out evil. The but, no follow-up noted. Others mention catheterizing with reed straws, resulting in bloody urination and a life lesson. Maybe that's why Egyptians believed disease was a curse, and doctors were mediums, not men of logic. In the papyrus Ebers, the most famous Egyptian medical text, it says, if the patient has chest pain and you're confused, let them sleep and summon the gods in their dreams. In other words, when you don't know how to cure it, just tell them to nap, and in a world with no antibiotics, no anesthetics, no hand sanitizer. That, oddly enough, might have been the longest-lasting survival strategy. Ancient surgery wasn't exclusive to Egypt. Oh no. If Egypt was where people cut in the name of faith and dreams, then Rome did it for victory, Greece for philosophy, and China for suspicion of knife wounds. All across the world, from Greek lecture halls, Roman bathhouses, to the Chinese mountains, humans kept trying to do one very brave and very foolish thing. Open up another human body to see what's inside, sometimes to heal, sometimes out of curiosity, and sometimes just to prove you're brave enough not to throw up after slicing open a corpse. The Greeks, especially in Alexandria, were among the first to publicly dissect real human bodies. Herophilos, one of those idealist mad doctors, once said, "To understand the soul, you must study the nerves." And so he sliced open necks to look for them. The Greeks clearly distinguished arteries from veins. They recorded pulses, heartbeats, even liver structure, and they loved to draw. These illustrations were sometimes as beautiful as Leonardo's sketches, just that they got the liver in the wrong spot. But at least they tried, and they believed that knowledge came from looking death straight in the face. The only downside, women weren't allowed to study medicine, and most dissected bodies were executed criminals. So you can imagine slicing open a liver while hearing curses like, "I'll haunt you for generations." Occupational hazard. Ancient Rome was different. They didn't cut open bodies for philosophical curiosity. They ripped them open because of war. Roman army doctors got used to slicing into half-dead soldiers on battlefields full of smoke and chaos. Their surgical knife was called a scalpel, with a short blade and curved handle, designed to open wounds fast and stitch them up clean. Galen, a legendary doctor, once worked in gladiator arenas. He documented bones, joints and muscles from injured slaves. He once wrote, "A healthy shoulder blade is like a strong tree root, but if struck with a club, it breaks like a radish." Really? He wrote that. Rome didn't forbid women from studying medicine, but they were only allowed to be nurses or midwives. Surgery? Sorry, that was a man's job. Short tunic scalpel in hand, shouting Latin, a scene more like an action movie. Only it was real blood, real pain, and no happy ending. Unlike Greece and Rome, ancient China wasn't into dissecting corpses. Why? They feared damaging the body, a gift from one's parents. A good physician was one who placed a hand on your pulse, closed their eyes, and told you exactly what your liver was feeling. Instead of cutting you open, they used diagrams of organs on scrolls, theories of yin-yang and the 5 elements and energy pathways to diagnose. And strangely enough, their guesses were often pretty accurate. Some Chinese medical masters became famous, not for dissection, but for knowing what was inside without cutting. They wrote poems from pulse patterns diagnosed based on tongue color and facial tone. Sometimes their treatment leaned more toward philosophy than surgery. Do not treat the body, treat the mind. However, in certain dynasties like the Tang, autopsies were allowed for solving murder cases. The washing away of wrongs described how to analyze stab wounds, blood flow direction, and even question the corpse with incense. Surgery as ritual, not technique. You didn't open the body to find where the liver was. You opened it to ask the soul why it was hurting. And during certain golden ages, like classical Greece under the Ptolemies or Tang era, China surgery wasn't just a doctor's job. It was a battlefield between science, religion, and courage, where one incision could challenge an entire belief system. Whether in Greece, Rome, or China, ancient surgeons often didn't live long, either because they were accused of sacrilege, caught diseases from the dead, or because they messed with things you're not supposed to know. But thanks to them, we now have a map of the human body, even if that map was drawn with blood, sap, and a few tears. And sometimes even those who cut the wrong direction deserve to be remembered, because they were the first to dare ask what is truly inside us. There are decisions that leave no echoes, no inscriptions on stone, no stories told during incense offerings, no beautiful verses, no medals, but they survive quietly, persistently, and sometimes they're the only reason a woman doesn't shatter into pieces. Birth control in ancient Egypt wasn't something you learned from books. There was no curriculum, no regular training, just whispers and experienced eyes. It was an invisible decision, but it resisted something very tangible: the obligation to give birth with the flood cycle. There's no other way to say this. Refusing to bear children at that time was the quietest act of defiance you could commit without being stoned or labeled as rebellious against divine will or neglecting maternal duty. No secret societies, no codes, just a very small moment when two women rinse cloth by the river, not looking at each other, but hearts brushing for a fleeting second. I understand. No sharing of details, no need to inspire, no official acknowledgement from Ra or the Egyptian Ministry of Health. Just silence. That isn't lonely. A nod, as light as Nile dust, but heavy as a vow never spoken aloud. Everyone knew, the husband suspected, the priest knew well. The healer prescribed herbs to cool the womb and looked away like it meant nothing. The merchant wrapped the strange powder in rough paper and said, "For the stove." Everyone knew, and everyone pretended not to, because to admit it was to admit women had rights over their own bodies. And for many, that was like admitting the sun could rise without the king's permission. No official records noted the details. Inscriptions only said air calming medicine. The physician just drew a symbol. Egyptian medicine called it balancing the yin energy, as if talking about the weather, not the uterus. Yet women remembered, as if their memory was programmed to bypass every crack in the system. They remembered through lullabies from their mothers, through the way herbs were mixed at the right hour, through the glance passed to a daughter at the age of cramps. And they never wrote it down. They wrote it with placenta. No one signed the ancient birth control formulas, no first inventor, no patents. No one was celebrated in epics for sparing a woman from giving birth again, while still feverish from the last. These formulas, blended from dung, honey, bark, and asylum prayer, were passed from grandmother to mother, from mother to daughter, like a secret not meant to be known, but not to be forgotten either. It wasn't a legacy, because no one dared call it that. But if you look closely into the eyes of an Egyptian woman sitting quietly by the bed, holding a grey leaf softening in her wet palm, you'd understand. She wasn't praying, she was deciding. Choice wasn't just to birth or not to birth, it was who to marry, how long to stay, and whether she could leave after the fourth child. Some women use birth control, not because they hated children, but because they wanted to keep a little piece of themselves after giving birth to everything else. Some held the recipe in their heads, not because they were witches, but because they were the only ones who knew how not to become population machines. You don't see them in epics. No statues built for the woman who crushed lotus seeds just right to delay ovulation. No ceremony honoring the wife who secretly dropped contraceptives into the evening cider to save herself from one more year of postpartum bleeding. They just lived, then died. No one carved their names in stone, but the lives of countless others began from their choice not to act. Maybe no one will say your name. No one will paint you on tomb walls among gods and blooming fertility festivals. But in every woman who looks into the future and says, "Not now," you're still here, because you, the woman who needed no weapon, no sermon, just one nod and something mixed into a handful of dirt, opened a path to autonomy. That path wasn't paved with gold, just scattered with sand and the smell of crocodile dung, but it existed, and you were the first to walk it. We have laboratories. They had Nile River mud. We have lab rats, synthesized enzymes, and a team of researchers in white lab coats. They had garlic crocodile dung and a small dream of surviving 3 childbirths. And then one day, modern science looked back and stood speechless, not out of shock, but because sometimes those women who never went to school understood their bodies better than the reproductive science professor at Cambridge. When archaeologists began unearthing ancient Egyptian medical papyri, they discovered bizarre contraceptive formulas, from crocodile dung to honey mixed with beeswax and acacia resin. Modern science, as always, was skeptical, until they ran the analysis. The result? Acacia, when fermented, releases lactic acid. A spermicide crocodile dung, with its high pH level, can create a hostile environment for sperm. And honey, besides being sweet, it's also antibacterial. No one is encouraging you to try those methods again, but science, awkwardly, had to admit, ancient Egyptian women weren't just guessing. There was a time when researchers called it primitive birth control, as if all those women did was grab the wrong mud and pray. But today, the term has changed. They call it traditional ethnopharmacology. Sounds more respectful and more accurate, because now people understand. Ancient birth control was the product of centuries of trial and error, quiet observation and silent sharing. No Google, no ovulation charts, just lives, and the very real cost of not being able to control reproduction. Today, some pharmaceutical companies have begun revisiting ancient formulas, not out of nostalgia, but because they realized many natural things once dismissed are hiding impressive pharmacological potential. We live in a world of pills, implants, IUDs, and cycle tracking apps. But in the very moment you swipe through your period tracker on your smartphone, a whisper from the ancient past echoes. We track too, but differently, not with data, but with memory. With sleepless nights from missed periods, with coughing up blood after birth, and still having to breastfeed. With knowledge passed down through words, never written down, but never forgotten. Today's science owes them thanks, not because they were perfect, but because they, even uninvited, participated in the development of women's medicine with their very bodies, not through degrees, but through courage, not through TED Talks, but through whispers in markets in birthing rooms, in dreams, never fully slept. You live in a time with over 15 modern contraceptive choices, but take a moment to remember the Egyptian woman sitting silently by the river, holding a handful of mud and gazing into the distance, not out of daydreaming, but because she's calculating something very serious. What would happen if today she couldn't stop life from beginning? Dung sounds filthy, but for Egyptian women, it was a rejection. A rejection of birthing one more child when there wasn't enough grain. A rejection of lying in wait for death. After the 5th delivery, a rejection of being a tool of reproduction for society, religion, and male bloodlines. Placing a ball of crocodile dung into one's body wasn't out of ignorance, it was because that was what they could control. The only thing in a world where every decision had already been taken from them since birth. Official history didn't record these recipes. No one carved the name of the person who invented the first acacia-based contraceptive. No one built monuments for the first woman who knew how to stop. And that's why we have to listen to the dung, because it is their last remaining voice. That voice isn't clean, isn't fragrant, isn't printed in textbooks, but it is real. Some parts of history are written in blood, others in tears, but there are also parts, quieter still, written in waste, in herbs, in silent bleeding, and in the eyes of women looking at each other in a civilization that didn't let them speak. You might think, this is ancient history, but try asking, since when have women truly had the right to choose childbirth, or not? Since the invention of the pill? Since legal reforms? Since the internet? No, since the first woman used crocodile dung and chose life for herself. They have no names, no personal tombstones, no remembrance days. But every time you read those ancient medical lines, every time you see a strange symbol about how to keep the womb at rest, remember this. It is a greeting from a woman who lived 3,000 years ago. She's whispering to you, through the scent, through a layer of dung, through a tiny decision that saved a life. We live in a sanitized age. Automatic toilets, pH balance cleansers, contraceptives engineered with nanotechnology. But the greatest lesson from those women is not in the formula. It is in the courage to survive at all costs. The courage to do what's right, even when the world says it's wrong. The courage to accept filth, as long as it grants freedom. The courage to say, this is my body, I choose how to live. This is not just a chapter about contraception. It is the final chapter of a silent epic written in scent. Read in gratitude. There are periods in history where people killed each other for land. There are other periods for gold, for kingship, for honor. But there was also a time when people killed each other for ideas, not because someone carried a sword, but because someone carried a book. We're talking about China, around the 5th century before the Common Era, not the China of today, with a unified government, a common language, and a defined identity. No, back then, this land was divided into dozens of small states, known as warring lords, entering one of the most brutal periods in ancient history, the Warring States period. No federation, no constitution, no Chinese people. Only the states of Qinchu, Zhaowei, Hanqiyan, each with its own laws, its own king, its own currency, and a blood feud with all the rest. And yet, amidst the territorial battles, something else was also rising quietly. A war of ideologies. You can imagine this was an era where philosophy bloomed like tech startups in Silicon Valley. Confucianism, calling for a return to ethics and humaneness. Taoism, promoting harmony with nature and non-intervention mohism, preaching unconditional love and anti-war legalism, claiming all the above are useless, that only discipline, punishment and fear can prevent a nation from collapse. Each ideology was a proposal to save the world and the feudal kings, spinning in the chaos of blades and rebellion, had to pick something to believe in. And so ideas became a weapon, but unlike traditional weapons, you couldn't see an idea coming. It made no sound. It had no blade or arrowhead. It just quietly took root in people's hearts, and that made it more dangerous than anything. To an authoritarian state trying to dominate the world, a thinking mind was the ultimate threat. At that time, Qin, a Western state, was on the rise. It wasn't as rich as Chu, not as refined as Qi, didn't have the philosophical heritage of Lu, home of Confucius. But Qin had one thing, a cold and ruthless will. Qin chose legalism, not because it was morally right, but because it was effective. Legalism didn't need citizens to be good, just afraid, didn't need loyalty, just obedience. And so, step by step, Qin began expanding its territory, not with inspirational speeches, but with hand-cutting punishments, strict censorship, internal spies, and a legal system so heartless it could punish someone for misreporting the farming calendar. Knowledge, if not serving the state, would be erased. Thought, if not sanctioned by the king, would be seen as rebellion. And thus, we enter a chapter of history where no one was allowed to think without approval, where silence became a virtue and understanding became a crime, where an empire chose to burn books to unify language and bury people to unify thought. And if you were a teacher in that era, a scholar with students with books, with faith in courtesy and compassion, then sadly, you were no longer a teacher, you had just become redundant. In the minds of many Americans, a nation is a clear outline on a map, a place with borders, a government, a flag flying atop the capital. But if you lived in warring states China, there was no such thing as a nation, only land armies, and whoever was strongest at the time. Around the 5th century BCE, after the gradual collapse of the Zhou dynasty, the land of China shattered like pottery on stone. At first, there were hundreds of small states called vassals, but over time, and by the laws of survival, only 7 beasts remained. Qin Chu Qi, Zhao Yan Han Wei. The Chinese called them the 7 warring states. Westerners might picture them like 7 independent states, each with its own laws, military tax system, and one shared ambition, to devour the rest. Each state had its own personality, like characters in a bloody political novel. Qin, cold efficient, uninterested in culture, focused solely on victory. The first to establish a professional bureaucracy, dividing land into counties and districts, replacing nobility with royal appointed officials. Its core belief, legalism. Every person a cog in a machine, nothing more. Chu, vast resource rich, but organizationally loose, a place with a flourishing tradition of literature, music and ritual, which made it indecisive on the battlefield, a giant with clay feet. Qi, wealthy from trade and seaports, an academic hub where hundreds of scholars gathered, like an ancient Silicon Valley. But they believed more in intellect than in swords, making them vulnerable to manipulation through clever diplomacy. Zhao Yan Han Wei, caught between bigger powers, constantly shifting alliances like children forced to play grown-up politics. Zhao once fielded elite armoured cavalry that terrified Qin, but eventually collapsed from the exhaustion of defence. Yan nearly assassinated the Qin king, but failed and was obliterated in revenge. There was no United Nations, no ceasefire agreements, no Geneva Conventions, only one law. Either you build your walls or you get burned to the ground. People call it the Warring States period, not because historians wanted a cool name, but because war was the default state of existence. Relentless, unforgiving, unmoral. In just 250 years, there were over 500 major wars recorded, not counting countless skirmishes at the borders. Death wasn't an accident. Death was the expected outcome of simply being born at that time. If you were a farmer in Qi, one morning you might wake to smoke on the northern horizon and the sound of war horns. You knew what that meant tonight. You might no longer be a citizen of Qi. You could be a slave of Chu, or an unmarked corpse beneath Han's walls. Your political status shifted with the wind. And if you were a king, every year you hosted envoys, sent your children as hostages, paid for spies, wrote desperate pleas for aid, and deployed your troops. Like we schedule trash collection today, there was no trust, no true allies, only what kings called strategic adaptation, which meant shaking hands with someone today to kill them next week. A map of the Warring States era, if drawn in ink, would never stay accurate for long. But if you paid close attention, those maps weren't just geography. They were genetic political legacies, written through forced marriages, hereditary warlord clans, and blood-bound alliances where romance had no place. In each state, power often didn't lie solely with the king, but also with great clans. The Mengs in Qi, the Fans in Zhao, the Lis in Chu. These clans had their own armies, land and laws, like miniature nations inside nations. Sometimes, to secure a few years of fragile peace, a king would marry off his daughter to another king, knowing full well she'd be held hostage. Those princesses never returned to their homeland, and deep down, they knew they weren't diplomatic brides, but living political insurance policies. A warring states map had no color, but if it did, it would be red for blood and greyish-blue for family trees written in fear. And if drawn in blood, it would always be accurate. In that era, ideas survived only when they stood behind the right spear. And so, even though hundreds of philosophical schools emerged, only a few survived, the rest were buried, sometimes literally. So the real question is, would you write a book if you knew the first person to read it would be your executioner? When war drags on too long, people don't just kill each other with swords, they kill each other with arguments. No one survives by sword alone, but one correct sentence, said at the right time, can make an entire dynasty switch sides. That's why during the Warring States period, philosophy became a weapon of survival. This was a time unlike any other in Chinese history. Almost all at once, dozens of philosophical schools flourished like bamboo after rain. People called this era 100 schools of thought. Some believed in ethics and benevolence, like Confucius, then Mencius. Some advised letting all things be, like Laozi and Zhuangzi. Some were cold and pragmatic. They demanded iron laws and strict punishments, the legalists. And there were dozens of others, Mohists, logicians, yin-yang, theorists, each preaching truth, like peddling miracle cures in a war market. If in the West this era was Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, then in the East it was an explosion of survival theories. Greeks debated in the squares of Athens, while in China, a single misstatement could earn you a death sentence. In Athens, freedom of thought was a basic right, but in Qin, wrong thought wasn't just wrong. It was treason. Same rationality, but in one place it was the foundation of democracy. In the other, it was a target to be destroyed if it didn't serve victory. The Warring States period taught one thing. Philosophy wasn't for self-discovery, it was for survival or annihilation. One key feature of this time: philosophers didn't sit in temples. They were like traveling warriors. Without swords, they carried books. Each was a one-man missionary campaign, crossing passes snow and the borders of feudal states, just hoping to be granted an audience with a king. Once Mencius walked for months to meet King Hui of Liang, only to be rejected because of a busy schedule. Once, Junzi was expelled from Zhao's court for speaking against war, and nearly executed for comparing the king to a child with a knife. But they didn't stop, because they believed if they didn't make it in time, the court would listen to the wrong person. And if a king listened to the wrong person, tens of thousands of citizens would die for the wrong reasons. They didn't sit in meditation. They wore coarse robes and walked across feudal states, court to court, pitching ideas. If you were a king, you might meet someone like Mencius, telling you that the people are the foundation of the state and that a king should be benevolent. Then the next day, another scholar arrives, saying that people only obey when they fear, and a few executions are needed to maintain order. Who would you choose? Some kings chose Confucianism, some chose legalism, some chose both, depending on convenience. But gradually, one ideology climbed to dominance: legalism, not because it was noble, but because it best suited warfare. Legalists didn't believe in kindness, didn't believe in enlightenment. They believed in fear, control, and ruthless punishment. If a state like Qin wanted to defeat the other six, they couldn't waste time teaching people to be good. They needed people to obey, like machines. They needed generals who didn't argue, but gave orders, then executed them. The legalist ideology, shaped by Shangyang Shen Buhai Han Feizi, became the backbone of the Qin state, and eventually the winner in the war of ideas. But that victory didn't come through debate. It came through burial pits, because in the hands of the Qin, they didn't just have an army. They had full control over rewriting the memory of the world. When they burned books, they didn't just destroy knowledge. They severed the link between people and their past. If you no longer knew your ancestors thought differently, lived differently, then you were left with one single reality, what the empire allowed you to know. The act of burning books and burying scholars was a form of hard drive, formatting a new society. No old files, no one remembered enough to resist, because there was nothing left to remember. When Qin Shi Huang unified the realm, he didn't just gather weapons from the 6 defeated states. He burned their books and buried alive the scholars who objected, not because they were dangerous, but because they made the people start asking questions. Questions were the one thing the empire could not tolerate, because once the people learned how to ask, they would never stop. If Confucianism was a gentle piece of advice, then legalism was a criminal sentence. No pleas, no humanity, only law and punishment Legalism wasn't born to teach people to become better. It was made to make people afraid of doing wrong. This ideology came from a ruthless but reasonable view. Humans are selfish, so let their selfishness serve the state. Shang Yang, one of legalism's founding figures, once enacted a law. Whoever reported a crime would be rewarded. Whoever didn't would be punished alongside the criminal. The result? Villages monitored each other. No one dared to cover up another's mistake. Ironically, Shang Yang himself, the man who built that very system, became its victim. After the king died, new officials hated him, framed him, and sentenced him. He tried to escape the country he helped build, but because of his own law, which banned sheltering criminals, no inn dared let him stay. He was caught, executed, and dismembered in the marketplace. A system so cold, it devoured its own creator. Society became a machine. No emotion, no mercy, only fear and order. Han Feizi, a later legalist thinker, introduced the model of absolute control. The ruler must never reveal his intentions. The law must be like a mold. Anyone off shape gets pressed to fit. And above all, control language. Because language leads to thought, and thought leads to rebellion. As George Orwell once wrote in 1984, "He who controls language controls thought." Legalists understood this. Over 2,000 years ago, if you erase words like justice, freedom, or change from people's vocabulary, eventually they lose the ability to even imagine those concepts. No one revolts over what they can't name. In this model, the king was the absolute center, but didn't need to love the people, didn't need morality, only needed to make sure the people believed that doing wrong meant paying a price. Legalism wrote laws for everything. How to plant rice, how to serve in the army, how to report catching a thief. No need for goodwill, just obedience. Like a giant artificial intelligence system, legalism was programmed to run with precision. No deviation, no compromise. It didn't care if you cried, didn't care why you failed. You failed. You were punished. In such a society, people were no longer human. They were gears broken. Replace them, misaligned, remove them. Efficient, yes, but it could also crush your soul. And when Qin Shi Huang unified the realm, he poured the entire legalist ideology like a freezing source code into the new state. The result, the most powerful empire of its time, but also an empire where both citizens and officials lived in fear. An empire that didn't need the people's love, only needed them to be afraid enough not to rebel. And then came the tragedy. Only 15 years after Qin Shi Huang died, that empire collapsed. Legalism won the war, but no one could survive peace under fear, because in the end, people can't be ruled by the whip forever. They need something softer, something not written into law, something called trust. While other states still dreamed of golden ages, Qin didn't dream, Qin calculated. While Zhao and Chu debated who deserved to be called the righteous ruler, Qin quietly gathered grain-forged swords and built roads. They placed horse relay stations every 15 miles, established a unified system of measurements, and built long walls, not for beauty, but to keep the blood from flowing back. Qin had no soft philosophy, only iron principles. Anyone who couldn't do the job was replaced. Anyone who did well was rewarded with land, not poetry. It was a machine driven by a complete belief in order. No one was allowed to dream differently. No one was allowed to write their own history. History was something issued. Qin didn't teach children to love the nation, but to obey. They memorized laws instead of poetry. A child in Qin grew up without fairy tales, without love poems. Instead, they memorized the punishment for breaking a clay pot, for answering an official incorrectly, for failing to report their neighbor's behavior. No one told stories of cleverness, only stories of who was punished the worst. Education wasn't meant to inspire imagination. It was meant to extinguish imagination from the egg. They remembered hierarchy instead of tradition. Qin didn't ask, "Who are you?" Qin only asked, "Do you obey?" And that's how they won, through iron discipline, through laws sharp as blades. But the cost? A society with no room for spontaneous kindness, no space for innocent mistakes, and absolutely no laughter. Qin didn't dream, but the people inside Qin sometimes just wanted to dream of one peaceful night. No surprise inspection. Qin built a system of social control so tight it could be called an ancient version of social credit. Every action, every word, even a glance, could be remembered by someone, then reported to the officials. No one knew when they would be checked. No one knew why they were called out. They only knew that a single negative mark on their record could affect their entire family. Qin didn't need local police. Qin turned every citizen into a surveillance camera. No arrest warrant for suspected thought crime. No need to watch your parents kneel because they misspoke in front of a minor official. A powerful empire, but so rigid it shattered after just one generation. When an empire is built solely on fear, it creates no loyalty. Only submission through fear, which crumbles like sand when the ruler disappears. No one loved the Qin regime, they only endured it. And when the first emperor died, the fear died with him. What remained was a tired society ready to rise up, not for any grand ideal, but simply because it couldn't endure any longer. Because dreams can't be killed by punishment. They only sleep for a while, then awaken in the form of a rebellion. In the year 213 before the Common Era, the Qin court issued an unprecedented ban. Burn the books, bury the scholars. Not because the books held military secrets, not because the scholars were plotting rebellion, but simply because they dared to remember. They dared to speak of the past. They dared to believe there could be another path. Prime Minister Li Si, once a Confucian student, was the one who urged the emperor to act. He said, "The Qin dynasty has just unified the realm. The laws are not yet stable. If the intellectuals keep bringing up the past, they will shake the people's confidence, and we cannot build lasting order." And so, thousands of handwritten texts were collected and thrown into the fire. The analects, the folk tales, the epics, the critical ideas, all turned to ash. This was not the only time humanity tried to burn memory. In 1933, Nazi Germany did the same, burning thousands of books at Bebelplatz Square in Berlin. Even in the United States, there were times when libraries were censored. Books were banned for harming morals. And every time this happens, the question returns: does burning books really erase what makes rulers uneasy? Those who kept books were arrested. Those who read aloud were watched. Those who taught children about Confucius were executed. But burning books only kills paper. It doesn't kill memory. So they moved on to deal with the ones who remembered, because remembering in a totalitarian regime is the most dangerous act. The one who holds memory is like someone hiding a knife beneath their coat. They don't need to shout. They don't need a plot. They only need to tell the story of a time that was different. And the current system already feels threatened. More than 460 scholars were buried alive at Xianyang. No trial, no defense, only a deep pit and silence. From that day on, no one dared to ask, what did the previous generation do right? No one dared to answer. I still remember. A powerful country, but severed from its own past. An immortal empire living in a state of deliberate amnesia. 1 year after the book-burning decree, in the winter of 212 before the Common Era, the Qin court ordered the execution of over 460 Confucian scholars in Xianyang. There was no formal verdict. No one was allowed to defend themselves. There was only one reason. They continued to teach things that were not allowed to be remembered. Among them were tutors of noble children. Some had once advised imperial policies, but now they were simply people who refused to forget. They were herded outside the city walls, tied up, forced to kneel before deep pits already dug. They were told to bow their heads not for mercy, but to make it easier for the earth to swallow them. Some whispered their final words. There are things that cannot be buried, but the dirt was still shoveled in. Alongside them were the last surviving handwritten books buried with their bodies, as if to ensure no one could recover either person or word. It wasn't just a physical execution, it was an attempt to erase memory with the very blood of those who remembered. And from that moment on, education had no one left to teach it. To kill a teacher is not just to kill a person, it is to sever the lifeline of intellect, to strangle a society's capacity for correction. From then on, children were no longer taught to understand, they were trained to repeat. No more classrooms, only memory training camps. No more questions, only pre-written answers. Only readers of books already approved. But books don't truly die, and thought, like weeds, never stays buried forever. They are crushed, burned, silenced. But if even one survivor, just one, remembers how to retell it, that idea will rise again. Quietly, slowly, but stubbornly, like a seed cracking through dry earth. And so, they buried the people, but they could not bury everything those people believed. In the year 211 before the Common Era, while Qin Shi Huang was on his 5th imperial tour, a quiet story began to spread among water carriers, among night watchmen striking their wooden clappers. It wasn't about a battle, it wasn't about a new law. It was about silence. Silence in the markets, silence in the schools, silence in the conversations around fire pits. Not because the people had nothing left to say, but because they knew what could make them disappear. The Qin Empire had become a massive entity without dialogue, only command, no scholars to debate, no historians to question, no musicians to write about sorrow, no one standing in the street to tell an old tale. All of that had been burned, buried, or smothered in the cradle. A child born in Qin at that time would never know who Confucius was. They would never know there was once a time when people taught that kindness mattered more than punishment. They would only know how to stand when meeting an official, what report to file. When a neighbor complained, how many degrees to bow when saying I obey. No one left to speak of a time that was different. No one dared to even think of it. But the problem with a world without critics is that when the king is wrong, no one says so. When the court makes mistakes, no one corrects them. And when the empire starts rotting from within, everyone stays silent, not because they agree, but because they've forgotten how not to be silent. Totalitarianism doesn't need blood if it has already taught people to stop thinking. And when the last people who remembered, who resisted, were buried deep, the empire believed it was safe. Until, from the very land thought to be most tamed, an earthquake rose, not from philosophy, not from doctrine, but from people too exhausted to be afraid anymore. Qin Shi Huang did what no one before him had done. He unified all of China with swords, laws, and fear. He moved the capital standardized units of measurement minted coins with round shapes and square holes, symbols of heaven, earth, and central power. He built long roads, connecting canals, and an immortal tomb, where a terracotta army would forever stand guard over his obsession with not being overthrown. And then he died. No trumpets, no one truly mourned. His corpse was hidden inside his touring carriage, hurriedly embalmed, and the servants used rotting fish to mask the stench of decay. A great emperor, yet no one dared speak honestly about his death. No public funeral, no words of grief, only whispers. Is he gone yet? Qin collapsed at what seemed to be its peak. Not because of foreign invasion, but because no one had any reason to stay loyal. There was no love for that dynasty, no beautiful memories worth grieving, only fatigue compressed and waiting to explode. Overthrowing an empire isn't hard when it's built on coerced obedience. Just 2 years after Qin Shi Huang's death, peasants revolted, soldiers defected. They marched behind any banner as long as it wasn't Qin. No philosophy needed, no battle cry required, just this: not Qin. And that was the end. An empire that could win every battle, but couldn't win the hearts of its people. A state that could unify the world, but left behind no song to be sung once it fell. No monuments, no heroic legends, only the haunting memory of total silence. Because victory, when bought with fear, only lasts until that fear disappears. People often think history is what gets recorded, on bamboo strips, on wooden tablets, on stone. But there are lines that never got written, stories that were never allowed to be told, and names that were erased from every timeline. We call it a gap in history. But really, it's not an omission. It's a deliberate decision. Someone sat down, picked up a brush, and crossed it out. The Qin Empire vanished like a clean break in a scroll. But what it left behind was a wordless warning that knowledge can be burned, memory bearers can be buried, but ideas do not die. Ideas take the long way around. They hide in lullabies, in fairy tales, in passing market chatter, in the memory of an old illiterate woman who still knows how to tell stories. And that's enough, because sometimes to bring down an empire, you don't need an army. You only need one person, willing to tell the story again. History isn't only what's written by the hands of the victors, it's also what was forbidden to be written, what was cut away, forgotten, erased. But if we listen patiently, we can still hear it. Beneath the ashes, a whisper, a scratch on stone, a scrap of paper left in a clay jar, a name no one remembers how to pronounce, but still exists, as long as someone wants to know, as long as someone refuses to believe history only has one version.